So I'm really excited to come here. I always like this seminar series because you get people from such a wide range of different perspectives speaking to questions of development within the sub-Saharan continent. And so I apologize for the slight title change because when Jackie sent me an email asking me if I would be willing to participate, I was working on this paper on gender dividends in sub-Saharan Africa. But by gender dividends, I have a very specific kind of narrow definition that emerges from this idea of demographic dividends. And so I thought today the most effective thing for me to talk about would be really kind of open the discussion more broadly about the role of sort of population in SDGs, then talk about the implications of demographic dividends, sort of what do we mean by this, how does it work. I'm going to talk about sort of theorizing dividends, if we think dividends might be beneficial, like how do we get them? And then I'm going to show you some evidence of dividends across the region. So that's the plan. If you have any questions and want to stop me at any time, feel free. Unless the question's really hard, and then don't ask it. Don't save it to the end either, okay? So this first point, population and the Sustainable Development Goals, I think is kind of an important one because historically, when we think about development, we think about population, most people are really talking about population as population growth, right? About the size of the population and the challenges that a large population presents. And so in this case, population is really framed as a challenge to meeting a lot of the different sustainable development goals. But demographers are interested in things beyond just population size. We're also interested in processes like changes in population structure, changes in the life course of individuals. And so on this front, the dividend actually sees population as an opportunity in terms of meeting some of the sustainable development goals. So that's what we're going to walk through today. So in terms of the first point about population's role in the SDGs, did anybody read the recent Goalkeepers report that came out like a couple weeks ago from the Gates Foundation or hear about it? Heard about it, right? So this is their sort of annual assessment on the world's progress in terms of achieving the SDGs, where we are at meeting the different targets. Does anybody know what they identified as the #1 challenge to meeting SDGs? Anybody guess? Population, right? Okay, okay. So, and population and Africa's population in specific. So they raise the alarm that decades of stunning progress in the fight against poverty and disease may be on the verge of stalling due to rapid population growth in the poorest parts of the world, and specifically in sub-Saharan Africa. So if you look at, the charts of people living in extreme poverty, if you look at 1987, East Asia and the Pacific has fairly similar rates. They start to fall, South Asia starts to fall, but sub-Saharan Africa remains really high. And by 2013, you still have more than 40% of the population living on less than $1.90 a day. And projections show that by 2050, 86% of the extremely poor people in the world are projected to live in sub-Saharan Africa. So if you care about poverty, and deep poverty in particular, sub-Saharan Africa is sort of the place that we need to be focusing our attention. And we're going to see all this growth partially due to the fact that rates are just higher in this region, but we're also going to see this growth because of the massive population expansion that's expected to happen over the next 100 years. So Africa is going to account for about 3.2 billion of the projected 4 billion increase in the global population by 2100. I just find this graph like really striking, right? Right now it's like 1 billion, but by 2100, it's up to almost a little over 4, right? And if you just think about how this shifts political power, how it shifts economic power, it's going to be really, really dramatic. So the magnitude of these demographic developments is going to be really transformational, both within the continent, but also for the global economy more broadly. So understanding population pressures within the region are going to be important. So coming back to the SDGs, if you look at the SDGs, you might notice, in terms of population, where is it? Right? It's not there. There is no population goal. There's no population target. There are some goals that are like more kind of tied to population directly. So reproductive health and child mortality, goal 3, are sort of more tightly sort of demographic goals. But beyond that, there's no population target, and I'll talk in a minute about why I think that's the case. But if we think about the other goals, population plays a big role, right, in terms of the number of consumers that you have and their impact on the environment, in terms of expansion of education systems, in terms of improving health, reducing poverty. Like, the denominator is typically population size, right? So if you just mechanically have more people, that denominator remains a challenge. Okay, but for a variety of reasons, population is sometimes called the elephant in the room when it comes to development questions and development institutions. And part of this is warranted, I think. And it's warranted for sort of two reasons. One is just the fact that in the not so distant past, you had some countries engaging in really abusive, coercive policies of forced sterilization, right, that were pretty horrific. And if you're interested in this history, Fatal Misconception by Matt Connolly is a fantastic overview of this phenomenon. So you had sort of past bad practices, and then also the debate in the past tended to be really polarized. Does anybody know who this is? This is Paul Ehrlich, who wrote The Population Bomb in like the 70s, right? And so there's this big debate in the 70s about the future of global population, and we have this overpopulation, too crowded cities, everything's bad, population's going to cause like world economic and environmental collapse. So you had him as a sort of Cassandra on one end, and then you had Julian Simon, an economist, on the other end, who was a much more Pollyannish view of population, and said, actually, you know what, population's fine. Like, the world can figure it out. Like, people are super smart, and the more people we have, we'll get some more Einsteins, and we'll like technologically solve our way out of all problems, right? And so you had a scenario where, you had really bad practices, and then you had this debate that was either like population is everything or population is nothing. And so because of that, I think the global development community just kind of had a lot of reason to disengage from thinking about population, right? But in the Gates report, you see sort of a more nuanced argument to think about ways in which we might sort of bring population back to the table and the importance of bringing population back into the table. So I like this quote from Alex Eze, who used to be at the African Population Research Center and now is a Center for Global Development. But he talks about the fact that the goal of family programs today is not to hit population targets. So it makes sense why population isn't like an SDG goal. We're going to reduce TFR by this much, right? That's not how we want to talk about it. We want to talk about it in terms of empowering women so they can exercise their fundamental right to choose the number of children they're going to have, when, and with whom. Fortunately, empowering couples to make decisions about their lives also improves Africa's future by changing the population growth scenario. So what we want to do is say, we're not trying to change population, we're trying to give women the tools that they need to achieve their own sort of fertility preferences, and also to engender or create situations where it's likely that their fertility preferences are going to go down, right? So the first step is about thinking about things like reducing unwanted fertility, right? So if you look at, this is the UN projection of population growth to 4 billion. If we were able to reduce unwanted fertility, and unwanted fertility is kind of interesting because it's actually, the way they measure it is you ask women of the births that you've had, like at what birth would you have liked to have stopped, right? So they'll ask women who have like 6 kids, and they might say, I wish I could have stopped at 4, right? So in some ways, this is actually kind of a low bar estimate, right? Because people are usually kind of justified to themselves. Like, people aren't terribly comfortable saying like, oh man, those extra 2, like that was too much for me, right? But if we were just able to sort of improve reproductive health services, we could reduce population growth by 30%. So that's pretty impressive. We can also think about reducing this by reducing demand, right? And so investments in girls' schooling is going to sort of increase the opportunity cost for kids, right? And so that's going to be another important factor. So increasingly, thinking about the size of the population is something that is sort of more on the table, but in ways that are more palatable, right? Okay. But there are also demographic forces beyond population size that are going to matter in terms of our abilities to achieve different sustainable development goals. And one of these is this idea of the demographic dividend. How many people here have heard about the demographic dividend? Anybody? A few people? Okay, like half? Okay. And so that's not surprising because it's a fairly recent term that emerged in like the early 2000s. There were some scholars at Harvard actually who were looking at economic transitions in South Asia and Southeast Asia. And they were trying to understand the effect of changes in age structure on economic growth. And they found that in a lot of the East Asian tiger countries, changes in age structure accounted for like anywhere between 25 and 45% of economic growth. So scholars saw that and thought, okay, well, a lot of sub-Saharan countries are sort of in the process of beginning their transitions. What might we expect from this? And it's an idea that's, so it kind of caught on within academia, and even more recently, it's really been taken up in the policy world. So this was, I don't know, a couple weeks ago at the UN General Assembly meeting. You had Nigerian President Buhari giving a talk talking about how demographic dividends could be really effective in reducing poverty in Africa. This is a report that came out this year from the African Union, which named 2017 as the year of the dividend. They're really into it in 2017. So it's an idea that's caught a lot of traction. And so now you might be asking, if you don't know what it is, like, why? Why is this a popular idea? So the dividend is the accelerated economic growth that can result from improved reproductive health, a rapid decline in fertility, the subsequent shift in the population age structure. So the idea is that with fewer births each year, your working age population grows larger relative to your dependent population, right? So you have more people working, generating economic growth, and you have fewer kids to take care of. Okay, and then there's this caveat that that this is a window of opportunity. The dividend is something that only happens once, and I'll sort of explain why that's the case in just a minute. And then it also depends on certain policies. So one thing that's a little bit confusing about the dividend, if you see it talked about in popular literature or even in the scientific literature, is that sometimes people are talking about it as like an outcome, the growth, right? Sometimes people are talking about it in terms of the process, right? The fertility decline that leads to the age structure change, that leads to the economic growth, and somewhere in there, like, policies matter, right? So people are talking about it in different ways. So this chart just shows sort of visually how a dividend is produced. So this is Thailand in 1965. This is their population pyramid. So this is just the proportion of the population in each age bracket, right? And this is women and this is men, okay? So this is a scenario where you have really high fertility levels. You have people having a lot of babies, right? So these are childbearing women, and they're having a lot of kids. So you have a heavy base. As fertility declines, right, as people start having fewer babies, your population age structure shifts to look more like this. So you have a greater proportion of your population in the working ages. They're engaged in labor market activity. You don't have a lot of old people yet, right? They're relatively small here, but you have a lot fewer dependents. And so during this time, families are able to invest more in kids. Governments are able to potentially tax more and then invest more in sort of like education infrastructure, health infrastructure, all these sort of socially positive things. And that's sort of when the dividend accrues. But the dividend only happens once. So countries typically go through a demographic transition where fertility is high and then it comes down. But that only happens one time, right? Like, you don't go back up to having a TFR of 7 and then come down again. It happens once. So it's this one-time window where you have a scenario where you have more working age people relative to dependents, because eventually you're going to reach a stage in your population structure that looks like this. So this is what you would see in a lot of European countries, in Japan, right, where you have a lot of older age dependents to take care of, right? So it's this one-time boost that you can get from changes in fertility. Okay, so why is the dividend sort of a buzzword in development circles right now? First, the fact that the Asian tigers represent a credible precedent. So I apologize because I have no idea what this says, but these are African countries. And this is GDP per capita. So this is South Korea, right? And so you can see in the 1960s, South Korea GDP per capita looks fairly similar to a lot of other African countries. But they had a huge economic expansion that happened, whereas we didn't see this here. During this time, they also had massive fertility decline too, right? And so this fertility decline really had a big impact on the economic growth that we saw. It wasn't the only reason, but it was a big part of it. The other reason why people are really interested right now is that Africa is currently sort of at the early to mid stages of fertility decline, depending on what country you're looking at. So you're entering a period where you have improved dependency ratios. So you have sort of like 80 dependents and then eventually decreasing, right, per 100 workers, okay? So this is a line for all the African countries. You can see like Niger is sort of the outlier here where you still have like really high fertility. So they're not expected to experience this until a little bit later. But a lot of the countries are sort of in this middle band where between 2020 and 2030, they're going to enter this time period where they can potentially seize on and actualize a dividend. Okay, so the dividend seems like it might be a good idea, seems kind of plausible, right? So how do we get it? So in terms of theories about like producing a dividend, a lot of times if you read reports, you'll see something that looks kind of like this. And I find this very unset. This is actually from an institution that I work with a lot, and I didn't put their name on here because I hate it so much. So, but I don't like this, right? Because it's like population structure, something happens, and then you have like all these good policies, and then you get something good, right? It's really not clear. I have no idea how I would actually estimate the effect of the size of a dividend out of this, and so I don't find it particularly useful. So instead of thinking about it in terms of like fertility transitions somehow lead to like economic growth, that's the dividend, we can think about it as more of a Markov chain process. And this is some work that I did with Professor Lundu, who's also in development sociology with me here. So the first thing is that fertility transitions has to actually lead to changes in age dependency, right? And so in some ways it seems like, oh, of course they do. Fewer kids, you get a shift in your age dependency. But this can depend on other factors. And so you could think about things like adult mortality and how that might shape changes in age dependency. And if you're thinking about sub-Saharan Africa in particular, there's reasons to think that might be an important factor. So if you think about countries where HIV/AIDS hit hard, they really hit the working ages, right? And so you could actually experience a fertility decline, but not necessarily have a super improved age dependency ratio because you hollowed out a lot of those working age workers via the HIV/AIDS epidemic, right? So it's not a given that you're necessarily going to have fertility transitions that translate one-to-one in improvements in age dependency. Okay. Similarly, demographers tend to sort of conflate age dependency and economic dependency. We say if you're between 15 and like 64, you're a worker, or if you're between 19 and 64, whatever the thresholds are, we just take those as a given and say those people are working, everybody outside is dependent. Obviously, that's not the case, right? Sometimes you might have child labor. In other situations, economic dependency only really works if people like have jobs, if they're actually being productive and working, right? If you have this bulge of working age population and they're not working, you're not going to get a big dividend, right? So we need to think about who's actually working. So economic dependency also has to then generate actual savings and investment. And that could happen or it could not happen, right? If you have big economic expansion and you have a lot of income being generated, that could be really good. People could be investing it more in their kids. The government could be investing more in social services. But you could also imagine a scenario where governments are instead stuck servicing debt. Or people are just increasingly like frittering their money away in non-productive ways, right? Just conspicuous consumption could be on the rise, and that would be sort of how the dividend got blown. And that savings in an investment can only lead to economic growth if you have like the sort of right macroeconomic sectoral policy. So the big point here is that you might have fertility transitions, and you might end up with a dividend, but you might not. So thinking about how this process unfolds is really helpful, because you can see sometimes we might get fertility decline, but we may not get improvements in age dependency. And so that would be where the dividend would be sort of stuck or stopped. Sometimes we might get improvements in age structure and even in economic dependency, but we might not get savings and investments if governments are just using that money to sort of pay down external debt. So fertility change can matter, but at each stage along the way, we may or may not get a dividend. Okay, and then the ideas sort of comes back. So in terms of very sketchy evidence for a dividend, we can look at the sort of macro level indicators along this chain. So if you think about fertility transitions, they're underway in the region, right? If you think about economic dependency, it's improving from this fertility transition. And we also see economic growth across much of the continent. So I could do some sort of like macro level country correlation and say, oh, these things kind of hold together, but those aren't particularly compelling arguments, right? Just sort of like macro level correlation has all sorts of problems with it. And so what I'm going to do instead is show you some evidence of a dividend, both in economic growth, in terms of schooling, in terms of gender. And I'm going to use in each of these cases, I'm going to use a demographic decomposition approach, or a variant of demographic decomposition. If you're really excited about the methods, I brought these lovely books that I'm willing to share with you, so you can have one. The other thing I wanted to mention was that all of the data that I'm going to use for these 3 papers comes from publicly available data sets that anyone can download off the internet. So while doing field work, I think is phenomenal and wonderful. If you can't do that, you can still do really interesting research about population change. And so if you'd like to know more about the different data sets, I'd be happy to talk to you about them. Okay, so the first paper that I'm going to talk about sort of examines the linkage between, it's actually really age dependency and savings and investment. How have changes in age dependency affected savings and investment rates across the region? So this comes from a paper with 2 of my co-authors, Parfait Aludu and Michelle Tenique. And what we're going to do is look at how changes in age structure have contributed to economic growth. For this, we use data from the Penn World Tables and from Barrow and Lee's estimates of human capital. We're looking at countries in sub-Saharan Africa. We're looking at data from 1980 and 2010. And what we do is we say, okay, between 1980 and 2010, we see changes in GDP per capita, and we can use this modified Cobb-Douglas function, which my co-author, who's an economist, took lead on, so don't ask me too many questions about this one. But I actually had him explain it to me this morning so I could kind of intelligently talk about it. But anyhow, it just estimates change in GDP as all these different functions. So total factor productivity, stock of the physical capital per person employed, human capital, rate of employment, and age structure. So it's that age structure piece that I'm most interested in, right? And so this is the percentage growth in annualized growth in GDP per capita during this period. And you can see countries where you had large economic growth, mild economic growth, mild economic decline, and large economic decline. And I think what the important takeaway here is that in all countries where you had large economic growth, except for the case of Mozambique, population age structure contributed positively to this growth, right? So this just tells me the percentage of the change that was attributed to each of these different factors. So in all these cases, population age structure made a positive contribution to expansion of the economy. Same thing here. In countries where you had economic declines, right? So you had declining, you can actually see that changes in the age structure, they have this negative effect. So what this is telling us is that the economic decline would have been worse if you hadn't had improving age structure to kind of buffer that decline, right? And this is an ideal approach because a lot of times what happens in terms of research on dividends is that people say, well, we had fertility decline, we had changes in the age structure, we didn't have economic growth. And so they'll take that to mean that there was no dividend, right? But what this shows is that actually there was a dividend because your economic scenario would have been worse if you hadn't had this improving age structure, right? So that's sort of the argument there. Okay, so we see dividends associated with economic output. And the only case where you don't see dividends buffering is Niger, where you basically just have had no fertility decline, right? So that shouldn't be entirely surprising either. Okay, so the next paper I'm going to talk about is looking at evidence of dividends in terms of schooling, right? So we can think about how changes in age structure are going to free up resources and potentially allow governments to invest more in a variety of social services. And in this case, we're going to look at schooling. Okay, so here this comes from a paper that looked at the role of fertility in achieving African schooling, Millennium Development Goals, early evidence from Sub-Saharan Africa. So the question was, how have changes in age structure contributed to changes in educational resources available for children? We use World Bank data, countries are a unit of analysis, and we use mathematical decomposition. And basically we just say that changes in the resources per kid is a function of sort of overall resources in a country, the percentage of the budget that's allocated to education, and then the percentage of the population that are of school age, right? So we're not looking at how this affects enrollments, but we're just making the argument that age structure can potentially shape changes in the resources that is available for children, right? So this isn't the actual resources that are spent on each kid. That depends on how many kids go to school. We're just looking at the total size of the population. And here are some of the findings from this. So this map shows the change in the dollars spent per pupil from 1990 to 2005. The countries in green are countries where we had gains of more than $150. The countries in yellow are where you had gains of anywhere from $1 to $150. And the countries in red are places where you saw declines in the resources available per child, the dollar, sort of nominal dollar amount. So you see large gains in Southern Africa, and then sort of variation in the rest of the continent. But I also on here plotted the contribution of changes in dependency ratio. And so you can see in countries where you experienced large gains, changes in age structure accounted anywhere between 17% and 53% of the gain, was just due to the fact that you had a reduction in sort of that size of the youth population, right? And so it freed up a lot more resources for kids. Similarly here, you see the same situation where we had a decline in expenditures that were spent on kids, but that decline would have been worse if you hadn't had the changes in age structure, right? That's what that negative value there means. Okay, and so now I'm going to talk about gender dividends. So I got there. That's good. And I'm going to talk about Kenya. And so my interest in this idea of the gender dividend emerged because I've been working on questions of demographic dividends for a while. And I have been going to a lot of conferences, and there was a lot of talk on the demographic dividend, and then all of a sudden you have people talking about the gender dividend. And so you have seizing the gender dividend across the Sustainable Development Goals, demographic dividend with a gender dimension, young women in the demographic dividend, and then harnessing the demographic dividend means harnessing the gender dividend. And literally, I go to these things and I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Like, what do you mean by the gender dividend? But I think generally the argument that most people are making is that fertility declines have important implications for the population age composition of your population, right? But it also has important implications for sort of the life course experience of women. And So I was going to these talks and thinking about this. And then I also have 2 small children who, and having them, I realized like really changed like my ability to sort of interface with the labor market, right? So it was from this like personal point that I was like, oh yeah, I got to think more about this idea of the gender dividend. Okay, so the concept of the gender dividend recently entered the broader demographic dividend discussion. While the demographic dividend comes from shifting age structures towards more productive ages, gender dividends come from taking steps that increase the volume of market work and the level of productivity of the female population, right? And so again here, I think it's one of those cases where I'm not really sure, is it about freeing women to spend more time in the labor market, or is it about them engaging in the labor market in more productive ways, or is it about them having higher wages, right? It's not entirely clear. It sort of seems to be all of these things at once, right? And so another way to think about this is instead of thinking about sort of how fertility decline affects gender equity, we can think about it from the perspective that fertility decline should, in theory, free women's time, right? And this may or may not be the case. The freeing of women's time should lead to increased labor market participation, which then could potentially lead to gender equity. But at each of these stages, there's factors that we should probably pay attention to. So in terms of fertility decline, we talk about fertility decline most of the time in terms of TFR, the number of births that you have. But fertility decline also has really important implications for the overall trajectory of a woman's life course, right? So you can have 3 kids, but having 3 kids at 18, 20, and 22 is different than having 3 kids at 32, 34, 36, right? It's a different experience. The opportunity costs of it especially are really different. If you're 18, you could potentially be in school, right, in a way that you're probably not as much likely to be at age 32, right? Freeing of women's time can only result in increased labor market participation if you have both schooling availability and equity and job availability and equity. And then increased labor market participation will only lead to increased gender equity if you are able to address sort of broader cultural and political forces and also questions of pay equity. So in some ways, the continent is doing kind of well. So if you look at things like equity in schooling, this is primary school enrollment ratio. The blue color is places where girls outstrip boys. The red is where boys outstrip girls. So you do have some countries where you see fairly sizable gender discrimination in primary enrollment, and this actually goes up when you look at higher levels as well. But women are doing fairly well in a lot of places. Africa is also kind of interesting in terms of the female labor market participation ratio. So African women participate in the labor market at rates fairly similar to men, which is not the case in other regions where you saw big discrepancies in participation. So both of these things are kind of positive indicators in terms of achieving a gender dividend. Obviously, some of the problematic factors might be just the fact that there's low rates of employment overall. And so that's going to be a challenge, but it's not going to be as much of a challenge in terms of gender equity potentially. But this first step in the chain is really the one that as a demographer I'm the most interested in. So how does sort of fertility decline lead to a freeing of women's time? So this is a paper that I'm working on that actually with an undergraduate student here right now. And we're trying to understand how fertility transitions have changed the time spent in what I'm calling intensive mothering. And so this is just if you're pregnant or breastfeeding, right? So mothering, as I've recently learned, is hard no matter what age your children are. But if you are pregnant or if you're breastfeeding, like that is a additional sort of just physical demand. It's really hard to be engaged in other activities when you're like nursing someone every 2 hours and they need a lot from you. And so I'm going to look at data from the DHS from Kenya and the United Nations Population Division. And we're looking from the time period from 1989 to 2014, and we're going to use the decomposition. So we went with Kenya because it's a country where you've seen fairly rapid and sizable decline in fertility compared to most other countries. So in the 1970s, you have almost 8 births per woman, but it's declined to about 3.8 today, right? So pretty sizable decline. And so what we want to do is first just describe like what proportion of women are engaged in this intensive mothering role across their life course. And so this is the line for 1989, which even though I know fertility is high, like it's just really shocking to me in some ways, right? So in 1989, 60% of women aged 25 to 29 are taken out of the labor market, right? We think they're probably out of the labor market because they're pregnant, and that's really hard to be in the labor market, or they're breastfeeding, right? So you have a large part of your sort of young women population that isn't going to be able to engage in labor market activities. But by 2014, this is what it looks like, which is, yeah.
What sort of data where does the data for that sort of level of statistic come from?
So the DHS has data on whether or not you're currently breastfeeding and whether or not you're currently pregnant. And so what I did was I just created an indicator for pregnant or breastfeeding, and then looked at it by age. And then I combined it with the proportion of, to estimate the size of the population, I use a UN data to do that. Yeah. And so this, I think, to me, is sort of the first piece of the gender dividend, right? It's the freeing of women from this role during this time period. And so if you want to quantify it, you can look and see in 1989, 34.5% of your overall female population is spending their time in intensive mothering. But by 2014, it declines to 13.8%. So you see a 20% decline, which we're sort of tentatively calling like the gender dividend. And again, where this dividend happens also matters. So about 63, I did my math right? Yeah, 63% of the decline is in age groups where we ideally would like to see that decline happening, right? Because these are women who could be in school. These are women who could be sort of getting their foot into the labor market, right? They're not delaying labor market entry. And so their wages long-term are likely to be higher. So the next step that we're going to do in this work, yeah.
What accounts for the decline?
What accounts for the decline? In terms of, so this is just decline in fertility.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm like, is it successful family planning?
Right. So the next step in this that we're working on right now is actually running this for all of the sub-Saharan countries, and then looking to see how these broader sort of family planning factors and also educational expansion factors, right? As education expands, you also can imagine that staying that not being pregnant becomes more attractive, right? And so we want to look at sort of the correlates between national expansion education, national expansion of family planning, and the sort of gender dividend values. Yep.
So you're talking only about formal employment.
We are
wages in the what's usually called the formal sector.
We're not,
women farming.
No, we're not talking about. We're talking about people out of the labor market, right? So I'm not talking about what they're doing. I'm just saying that not being.
Why assume that women who farm, as women have farmed in Africa for a very, very long time, who don't stop farming when they're pregnant, they don't stop farming when they're breastfeeding, they just carry the baby around, nurse it.
Right, but even still, like you can make the argument that it's harder to be productive during that time, and that's what previous literature has shown, that like they're not as able to be productive, right? Because there is a certain amount of time constraint just breastfeeding.
Out of the labor.
They're not fully out of the labor market, but their labor market engagement is going to be more limited, right? So.
But you're including all the farming that women do.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. The only other question I have is about children. That there's also a lot of information about older children taking care of younger children.
Right. And so one thing that we're also going to do, right, because we're also sort of limited by the data that we have in this. So one thing we're going to do, because this is just if you have, if you're pregnant or you're currently breastfeeding, what we're also going to do is just estimate if you have a kid under 5 or like sort of a non-school age child, and sort of see what that looks like too, right? So it'd be a low and upper bound estimate of maybe a gender dividend.
Yeah, just if you have older children to take care of younger ones and you lose that.
If you lose that.
You're gonna have to spend more time taking care of the children as they grow if they don't have older children to take care of.
Right, or if they don't have other structures too. Yeah. For sure.
No, just in terms of fertility connections.
Right, right. But then you also just have less time spent childbearing in general, right? So sort of a trade-off. Okay, so in sum, because I'm rapidly approaching the end of my time, I think that broadly, ensuring the population remains a central issue in securing SDGs is probably a worthwhile effort. I think it's hard to think about our ability to achieve a lot of these goals if we don't bring population back into the table, but bring it to the table in a way that's a lot more nuanced than it has been in the past. I think that there's reason to pay attention to factors beyond population size. Again, I think the prospect of a dividend is pretty compelling, but it's also a one-time thing, right? It's a window of opportunity. So once this fertility decline happens, you can't go back, right? So the policies have to be in place now in order to really fully seize that opportunity. Because you can also imagine a case where the dividend happens, countries don't capitalize on it, and then all of a sudden they have a bunch of older age dependents that they have to take care of, which would be sort of a worst case scenario. I think there's fairly compelling evidence of dividends in terms of schooling, in terms of increasing the resources that are available to spend per kid, in terms of economic growth, and then also maybe potentially in terms of gender and what it means for women's life course. And then as a last step, the next question is, okay, well, we might see dividends, but policy really matters. And so what are we going to do with them? How are you going to capitalize on them most effectively? So when thinking about policymakers and what we need to do, it's really important to think about the dividend as something that happens, but also the dividends as a particular generation, right? So the young people that are coming into adulthood today are sort of the forefront of the dividend generation. They're the ones that, if we're going to achieve a dividend, are going to be achieving it, right? It's not just this sort of macroeconomic phenomenon that happens, like it's a bunch of people. And so there's increasing encouragement of national governments to really invest in African youth, because they're going to be the ones that are going to make or break this process. And so this is a project that I have right now in Cameroon, working with policymakers and young people to think about different policies to sort of help foster skills and think about ways for this generation to be sort of more resilient. And so if you're interested in details on this project, I'd be happy to talk to you more about it, but you can also look at our website, and we have a lovely video that you can also watch. But that's all I have for today. If you have questions, I'd love to hear them or talk more about them, but thank you so much for your time.
No, thank you very much. Open for session justice.
Hey, May May. How are you? Good.
So I saw that in the graph that you had for
Sorry.
cost, the change in dollar per pupil. Senegal was at 0%, and I just wanted like clarification on what that meant and how it came to that.
0%. So they had a small decline. I'd have to go back to the chart to look at the value, but basically it's not really 0%. It's like 0.01. So they didn't have a large change in age structure, and because of that, it didn't contribute much to changes in the resources available per kid. So their fertility change didn't matter that much here relative to the other changes that were happening at the same time in terms of changes in the economy and also changes in the allocation of spending. So I can send you the full paper if you like. Yeah, sure.
Hi, could you just talk more about unwanted fertility and reduced early births? Because I thought they were contradicting with each other. So can you just
Unwanted fertility?
And unwanted fertility and the reduced childbirths, early births.
Okay, so unwanted fertility is just the number of kids a woman says. So they ask, the way that they get at is they ask women like, how many kids do you wish you had? And so they ask them how many kids you have and how many kids do you wish you had. And so the unwanted fertility is just sort of the difference. They also calculate it by asking, sometimes they'll combine it with a measure that's like, of births in the past year, was it wanted or unwanted? And so sometimes they kind of weight it differently, but that's how they calculate it, right? So it's this estimate of births that women didn't really want to have. So it could be, so it doesn't entirely connect with sort of early births. You could have early births that are unwanted. You could have later births that are unwanted, right? So it doesn't pick up questions of timing. And in that way, it's kind of an inadequate measure. You're kind of right in some ways, right? Because it doesn't tell us about when those births were occurring. So what you can do to get around that is sort of look at the age of women and see what percentage of women who are currently age 15 to 19 have unwanted births. What's their percentage of unwanted births? And see how it varies by age cohort if you wanted to look at the difference between the two.
Thank you so much. I'm a soft social scientist, so this is really not my area, and it's very interesting. So in a social science literature on African youth, there's a very powerful arguments about this period of waiting and youthhood. This notion of waithood and youth being, because of the lack of work, an incredibly long period.
Yeah.
So how does that sort of factor play out in fertility patterns?
In terms of fertility. In terms of,
I mean, I see where it's got massive implications, like in the project you mentioned. But
yeah.
Do you see that in what sort of fertility patterns do you see in a context where there isn't work and there's all these levels of dependency?
Right. I don't know that I've seen anybody give a really specific or good answer to that, and it's a good question, right? Because you would think that in some ways, if there are no jobs, like I might as well just have kids, right? Like. You could make the argument that if people think that there's the opportunity cost of having kids is pretty low, like it makes sense to have them now. I would imagine that's part of the reason why fertility remains still fairly high in a lot of these regions, right? Because they look around and say, well, there's no job. So, I mean, you can see the same thing in the US. But I don't know if I have a good answer in terms of sort of like quantifying what the relationship looks like.
So in that notion that in that qualitative social science, there's an argument of this continuation of youth and all these things that you can't do because you're left in this limbo of not having work. And how that affects and shapes your choices.
That's actually, so that's sort of what I'm looking at. So in this project, I have a survey of 5,000 young adults that we're following over time to look at them in transition. One thing that makes it really hard to answer that question, there's not a lot of really great panel surveys of youth in the region. And so it's hard to see sort of how their life course shifts over time. We have all these cross-sectional data sets. And so it's really hard to answer those questions. Like if I'm not employed now, how does that affect my decision about childbearing or about union formation? And that's one of the things that I'm actually really excited about this in terms of being able to answer a little bit more deeply. Yes.
I liked your presentation very much because, like in my country, for the past 2 years, we've been looking at demographic dividends.
Where?
Malawi.
Okay.
Yeah, because we have like a higher population within that range.
Yep.
Within the economic range, but they are not well empowered.
Yeah.
So they transition from the dependence level to a level where you think they'll be independent,
but they're not. Yeah. Yeah.
So recently, the government has been putting in place different programs to put youth in vocational skills.
Yep.
Yeah. So we have now a lot of technical colleges that are providing different skills to youth, so that at least when they get to that level, they have something else to do.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's a little tough because they get to that level and they maybe didn't finish secondary school because maybe they don't have enough money to pay for their secondary education.
Yeah.
To get to that level. So now the government is also changing secondary education to be free for all. So maybe over time we may have a better demographic, like economic dividend.
Yeah.
Now people have like something to do. And
Yeah, more skills. So I think that's like what you see there is exactly what you can see across a lot of countries. And so improving like technical skill training, a lot of like entrepreneurship kind of pushing for those kind of skills, just trying to figure out different ways to allow this generation to be productive and engage in the labor market. And I think right now it kind of seems like it's a mixed bag of some are working really well and some are just, not. And so I think the question now is trying to evaluate what works and what doesn't. That's the other thing that we're doing in our project is like, it's a lot of like randomized control trial kind of policy evaluation.
Just a comparative thing.
Yeah.
In India, and usually there are certain policies in place. For example, to improve the child health, there is a policy in India that you give 6 months of maternity leave so that the mother has enough time to take care of the baby. But that contradicts actually, because while hiring, especially in the government government it's fine, but private sector normally they say the women is that age,
Yeah.
age. Then I think they say okay. So how such things are handled in Africa?
I think it really depends. It varies by country and by context, like where you are in the country. But I think that like maternity leave and how to deal with like women having children. That's a question that no one that many countries have not answered well, including the U.S. Right? Like we get like 6 weeks, right? I think something like that. 6 weeks.
Or nothing.
Yeah. 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 Yeah, it's pretty, and that's not guaranteed paid. It's just they'll hold your job for you, right? Like you don't get any money. They
Does
just
it mean that India has better policy on this?
yeah, you're winning.
yeah, that's right.
But it's a huge question, right? And so that gets into broader questions of sort of like labor market discrimination against mothers, right? And we still see that here. There's actually, this is kind of a side tangent, but I'm going to go with it. There's a guy in PAM who does these really interesting, they're called audit studies, and basically you take 2 resumes that look exactly the same for women, and on one you indicate motherhood, and he does this through like the control volunteers with the Red Cross, but the mother volunteers with the PTA. So the resumes look exactly the same, except for like one volunteers with the PTA to kind of signal that they have kids, and like you see like massive discrimination in terms of employers like calling back women and stuff like that. So I don't think anybody's sorted that out, but it continued to be a pressing question.
Yeah, we have a good policy. We are still trying to sort out how to, deal with the employment.
Yeah.
During the productive period, that is the main challenge.
Yeah, it is a challenge. Yeah.
Yes.
If fertility is decreased and women do have more freed up time, where are they expected or where do they participate in the workforce?
So that's a good question. It's sort of a second order question from what I'm just trying to see where are they freed? Like when are they freed? To what extent are they freed? And where are they freed? Because I think it's a better measure than just looking at TFR, because that doesn't really tell me about women's lives very effectively in terms of fertility change. But I think what you could do with this is you could maybe look at data on labor force participation at different ages and try to simulate different scenarios where if you get sort of this much of freed up and you are able to engage them at sort of 100% in the labor market versus 50%, what's the sort of economic trajectory? So you could use existing data from other studies and try to sort of simulate what this would mean. But that's not what I'm doing here. Sure.
As the board is going around, can everybody please sign it, even if you're not a student? Because we used to have where it was only enrolled students who had to sign, but now they're tracking attendance. So if it comes to you, please, you don't have to check enroll, but please do sign it.
Good to know. Yes.
So I'm wondering, how is the activity in the labor force measured? Because I know.
So I don't measure it here, right? I'm just looking at.
Is there?
I'm just looking at women who are less likely to be in the labor market because they're nursing or pregnant, right? So I'm kind of leaving out that next step of labor market participation. Yeah. Yeah, sure.
I asked already.
No, fine.
What can you give a sense of the data sources? I would imagine that across at this continental scale, you've got different traditions and contemporary practices.
Yeah.
No one ever asked me when I breastfed till, so I'm amazed at that data set.
Yeah.
What are the topographies of data that you can have?
So for this study, I draw on the demographic health surveillance data sets, which are really rich. And if you're interested in doing research for any of the students here, like they are a phenomenal data set. They're from around the world. It's not just Sub-Saharan Africa. There's the India DHS. There's a bunch in the sort of Southeast Asian countries. And they're really nice because they're standardized. So the questionnaires are standardized across place and time. So you can look at variables over time and see how things have changed. The early waves, so they've happened in waves. They're not like, it's not like every 5 years, but it's sort of every few years in different places for different reasons. They happen, and they're funded by USAID. That's who pays for them, and they're nationally representative. They're nationally representative surveys of women aged 15 to 49, and they also have data on everybody else in the household too. So I've done a lot of my work with those because they're micro level data sets, and you have these nice waves so you can look at change over time really effectively. The other data sets on the sort of macroeconomic indicators are the Penn data sets. Those are country level indicators. The schooling dividend was from the World Bank, which is also country level. But if you're interested in doing like micro level research, the DHS is a phenomenal data source, and you just go online and they have a little online they call it stat compiler, so you can do like basic analysis online. You can break up indicators into sort of look at relationships between a couple variables, so you don't even need like a stats package to do it. It'll make lovely maps for you and lovely like bar charts and line charts for you. And the quality on that is pretty good. In the region in general, like data quality, so I actually just read, there's a really great paper on, it's called the political economy of data in Sub-Saharan Africa. And it talks about the really vast levels of data quality in the region. And I got to see this firsthand when I was there. I was in Cameroon a couple years ago, and I was with a friend who used to work at the National Statistics Office. And we roll in and we see all these like lockers of the census, right? So there's these big metal things on the floor and they're filled with papers. So we're walking around and checking it out. And they're like, yeah, we're missing like this one region though. We don't know where the guy is. Like, and they never got them. Like they just never found them, right? So data quality in the region is a problem, both for like logistical reasons, like things just happen and that leads to data quality problems. Data quality is also a big issue. I'm going to draw on the board. I'm going to show you something that I thought was kind of interesting. So if you look at estimates of schooling enrollments in Kenya, 1990, like 2010, if you look at the DHS data, it looks kind of like this, something like that, right? Pretty flat. Overall enrollment rates are pretty steady. But if you look at data from the Ministry of Education, it looks like this. And so these researchers spent some time thinking about like why this might be the case. And they find that in 1995, you get this big switch, right? And so this is enrollments. So 1995, you have real underestimation of enrollments. Prior to this, in 1995, you get overestimation of enrollments. And if you look, 1995 was a year when they changed how school fees and school payments were made. So prior to 1995, parents were paying a lot for schools. And so schools had an incentive to not report money, right, to the government, right? So you see lowering rates. But in 1995, you get direct payments from the federal government coming in. And so all of a sudden you're like, we have so many students, so many more students. So we actually have. And so you can see the same pattern with campaigns to like improve vaccination rates, right? So you see, so yeah, in the region, you have to be really careful about data quality in general. But the DHS is pretty good. I would say. Yeah.
I guess I'm still chewing a thing about, am I understanding accurately that you're making an assumption, not based on actual data, of how much women withdraw from the labor force?
I'm not even making an assumption about them withdrawing from the labor market. I'm just saying that being pregnant and breastfeeding makes it harder to be productive, right? So even if you're not fully out of the labor market, which a lot of women aren't, right? It's going to be hard. Like, it is just mechanically probably harder to be as productive, right? Yeah.
I mean, an example is in Liberia, they like braid hair down the waterside.
Yeah.
And I remember going there, and there was a lady who was like the favorite hair braider. And then there were like times when she wouldn't be available to braid hair. She's either feeding her child or she's breastfeeding. So I mean, even in the informal sector,
Yeah,
it impacts the work and the amount of time you can work.
it's going to pull you out to some degree. It may not pull you out fully, right? And in a large part of these cases, it probably doesn't, right? Because they have to continue to be involved, right?
There's no pregnancy
Yeah.
leave and there's no
Yeah.
provisions.
Yeah,
for
they have to,
breastfeeding.
right? But it's still a burden that women, men aren't facing this, right?
Well,
This is a
That's coming to I don't have experience.
And just playing off that thought, I mean, what you're getting at, I think, too, is that as the labor sector formalizes more and more, the penalty on women for breastfeeding or being pregnant is a lot more severe.
right. Yeah.
And so it's not, you might get some benefits by having fewer children, but you're also getting some of that offset potentially by having, less of your employment in the informal sector, where if you run a market stall, you could still be breastfeeding. Or if you're, working
That's
in
true.
the field, you could still be breastfeeding.
Yeah.
So it seems like there might be some offset, which would be really interesting to measure.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know how I do that, but yes. Yeah.
Somebody.
Yeah.
That's suggestions.
Yeah.
Yes.
So now are cultural factors, how do you call it? Like, do you take into account cultural factors with regards to the fertility?
So I'm saying this is sort of like how I think people are thinking this process unfolds. I'm just measuring this first level. I'm not talking about those later steps, but I think that, like, in theory, you could think, well, gender bargaining, right? Like the sort of women's control over resources, things like that also matters and is going to matter in the sort of like broader transition, right?